Hey there, do you ever catch yourself mid-thought and realize you're your own worst critic? What if one tiny change in that inner chatter could flip your whole life script? Lean in, because the story you're about to hear turns a prison whisper into a roar that shook America. When we talk about turning points in a life, real tectonic shifts that move a person from one continent of the soul to another, we usually look for something dramatic on the outside, a march, a headline, a microphone catching fire with prophetic words. Yet every public earthquake begins with a private rumble, and that rumble is the way we speak to ourselves when no one else is listening. Imagine a young man, caged not only by literal bars, but by the barbed wire of poverty, rage, and a nation's smothering narrative about who he is allowed to be. Long before daylight verdicts echo across courtrooms and street corners, his own midnight verdicts are whispering with relentless authority, "You are less, you are locked out, you are destined for the margins." Those whispers are so steady they feel like truth itself, until somewhere in the hush between heartbeats, a new sentence sneaks in. It rarely announces itself with trumpets. Perhaps it arrives as a scrap of scripture copied out in cramped cell-block handwriting, or the memory of a mother's lullaby that once floated above hardship like incense. However it comes, the sentence is startlingly different. You are more than you have been told. The shift is microscopic at first, the way a single click of the lens can bring a blurred horizon into sure relief. But once the inner conversation changes its grammar, every other dialogue must renegotiate. The warden's shout, the judge's decree, the slur on the street, all lose a little of their sting because the prisoner has begun to address himself by another name. Oprah has said for decades that our words are the house we live in, and you can feel that truth pulse here. Self-talk is interior architecture. It shapes the halls where memories echo and futures take root. Our young seeker begins replacing walls of can't with windows of could, and through those windows streams a light he thought was reserved for other people, lighter-skinned people, richer people, freer people. Inside that glow he discovers what every spiritual giant eventually learns. Liberation is an inside job first. The outside keys may come later, but the padlock on the mind must snap open from within. Books become mentors, prayer rugs become maps. Each time he bows his head, he is in fact standing taller, because surrender to something infinite lifts the finite self out of its cramped assumptions. The daily recitations, verses repeated in Arabic rhythms older than American injustice, are not magic spells. They are reinforcements of a new inner lexicon. Silence itself turns into a classroom where he practices a fresh vocabulary. Discipline, dignity, destiny. Slowly, the inner conversation stops echoing with street hustles and starts resonating with prophetic cadence. Talk about a miracle, the very mouth that once cursed circumstance now recites gratitude at dawn. The tongue that spit bitterness begins tasting the sweetness of divine mercy, and a man who was certain he had been forgotten finds that every heartbeat sounds like God remembering his name. From the outside, the change looks sudden. An angry figure disappears, a serene messenger emerges. But inside, the metamorphosis is granular, sentence by sentence, syllable by syllable. He edits the autobiography written on his bones and revises the margins where the world had scrawled worthless. Over time, the new draft feels so authentic that the old script reads like a stranger's tale. When the cell doors finally swing open, the world expects the same body of despair. Instead, it meets a being who carries himself like a verse made flesh. Journalists will scramble for the what, the when, the who did what to whom, but the real scoop is here. He changed the way he spoke to himself, and therefore altered the frequency at which the universe could answer him. A radical turning point. Faith as liberation, ripple effect on a nation, the power of personal reinvention, the inner conversation, a radical turning point. There are moments in a life when time seems to hold its breath, when the ordinary tick-tock of hours yields to a single seismic second that rearranges everything afterward. Picture a cramped prison library, late at night, dust-moted light spilling from a flickering bulb, the scent of aging paper mingling with the metallic tang of cold bars. Our young seeker flips through a weathered volume, its spine cracked like an old gospel singer hitting her final note. Up to this instant, each page of his existence has been inked in anger and survival, a litany of wrong turns, razor-edged hustle, and the echo of society's verdict that he is destined for oblivion. Then it happens. His finger lands on a passage describing surrender not as defeat, but as doorway. Submit, and find your true stature in the eyes of the divine. The words strike him like a bell rung inside the rib cage. For a heartbeat he doesn't merely read, he is read, as though an unseen author has reached through the lines and highlighted his restless soul. In that suspended hush, the cell walls melt into silence, the court records lose their power, and every insult hurled at his skin creed or lineage drops to the floor like chains sawed through. Make no mistake, this is not some glitter spray epiphany served up for a feel-good montage. This is a collision, destiny slamming into despair with such force that the universe tilts. And right there, in threadbare prison garb, he experiences a private revolution. A voice, call it conscience, call it God, whispers, you can become a servant of light rather than a soldier of rage. The proposition is terrifying because it demands the death of an identity meticulously built to survive brutality, but it is also intoxicating, promising a freedom that no lock could hinder. He closes the book, yet its syllables reverberate. Suddenly he is awake to an interior horizon he never knew existed, and the landscape is vast. He begins to see every prior humiliation, every fistfight, every courtroom sentence as dots on a greater map leading him here, this pivot between who he has been and who he might dare to be. Outside, night guards shuffle and radios crackle with routine, unaware that in cell block C, a star has just detonated behind a pair of wary eyes. Over the following days, the tremor becomes practice. He checks out more texts, discovers prophets who preach discipline over vengeance, communities that replaced color shaming with color pride, a faith rooted not in shame but in sacred accountability. He feels as if he has stumbled into a banquet after a lifelong famine. The nourishment is so rich he is almost afraid to swallow. Yet he keeps feasting, memorizing verses, copying them line by meticulous line, tasting their cadence until it becomes his native tongue. And here is where the turning point deepens. He realizes revelation is pointless without renovation, so he subjects himself to an inner audit. He lists the habits that have governed him: pettiness, bravado, reckless appetite, and asks each one to justify its residence in his heart. Many cannot stand the interrogation and are evicted. In their place he installs dawn prayers, fasting that sharpens intention, study that widens empathy. The shift is visible. Fellow inmates notice the quiet in his walk, the way he shares his food, the serenity blanketing his once volcanic gaze. Some mock him, calling the transformation a stunt. Others lean in, hungry for a taste of whatever wind now propels him. This radical turning point is not a single flash then fade. It is a sunrise stretching across days, revealing new colors each morning. He writes letters home, lacing them with newfound humility. He drafts speeches in the margins of law books, imagining a future where his words might free minds as surely as any physical jailbreak. By the time the parole board stamps his release, the man who steps into daylight is both the same clay and an entirely new sculpture. His first breath of free air feels ordained, as if heaven itself exhaled through his lungs, urging him toward streets hungry for a different kind of warrior, one armed with scripture and self-mastery rather than knife and fire. And so a single night in a forgotten library becomes the hinge on which a monumental life swings. Historians will later chart policies and protests, quote sermons that rattled the nation's conscience, but the real genesis is right here, the private vow birthed in that charged silence, the decision to reorient fury into focused faith, to trade the swagger of bitterness for the stride of a servant leader. From that vow will flow movements, controversies, and conversations that America still wrestles with, all because a man met his own soul in the margins of a borrowed book, and chose a different road. Faith as liberation, ripple effect on a nation, the power of personal reinvention, the inner conversation, a radical turning point. Faith as liberation. To understand how faith became the master key that unlatched a captive heart, we must first feel the weight of the captivity itself. Imagine years hemmed in by steel bars, but also by the heavier unseen shackles of self-loathing and racial contempt that society kept polishing for him to wear. He had been taught by sidewalks slick with desperation, by classrooms that dismissed him, by courtrooms that pronounced him disposable, that his value could be reckoned only in the coins of fear or ferocity. When a man has been fed that diet, he learns to prowl for survival, never to stand for significance. So when the whisper of a new faith slipped through the cracks of his confinement, it was more than theology. It was oxygen rushing into starved lungs. At first the rituals felt foreign, strange syllables spiraling off his tongue, measured bows that demanded an unfamiliar surrender of ego. But slowly he discovered that bowing did not break him, it aligned him. 5 times a day he pressed his forehead to the floor, and with each prostration he felt arrogance leak out, replaced by a dignified humility. Paradoxically, lowering himself before the divine raised him in his own eyes. For the first time, his worth ceased to be a negotiation with a hostile world. It became a settled fact scripted by the Creator. In that certainty, shackles began snapping like brittle twigs. The sacred text he studied spoke of prophets drawn from deserts, of ex-slaves elevated to leadership, of communities stitched together by justice and compassion rather than lineage or wealth. These stories wrapped around his bruised identity like healing bandages. Here was a narrative vast enough to hold both his pain and his potential. He encountered verses that thundered against oppression, verses that demanded the liberation of captives, the feeding of the hungry, the honoring of every human soul. In those commandments he recognized a divine endorsement of the very freedom he craved, not just for himself but for all who shared his chains. The personal merged with the political. Prayer became preparation for protest. Yet liberation was not only an external campaign. Faith drilled down to the subterranean chambers of habit. It restructured his appetites, disciplined his tongue, refined his spending of minutes and emotions. Fasting taught him mastery over impulse. Nightly invocations trained him to audit each day with merciless honesty. He began to feel an almost scientific thrill charting the transformation of his own character. Anger transmuted into articulate critique, street hustle redirected into strategic organizing. The religion did not ask him to abandon his fire, it asked him to refine it until it glowed torch-like rather than raged wildfire-like. In that alchemy he found the secret of sustainable resistance. Community too arrived as liberation. Letters from fellow believers reached him behind walls, men and women of varied hues who called him brother without hesitation. Their solidarity cracked the lie of racial hierarchy that had once seemed as immovable as the prison's concrete. Later, when he completed the pilgrimage and circled with throngs whose skin ranged from ivory to obsidian, he witnessed an embodied refutation of America's color caste. That vision branded itself on his conscience. If humanity could stand shoulder to shoulder before God, then any law or custom that ranked bodies by shade was blasphemy in motion. Armed with that revelation, he returned home unwilling to concede a single inch of dignity. Faith also liberated his imagination. Where earlier he had plotted turf battles measured in city blocks, now he conceived strategies measured in generations. Prayer unhitched him from the tyranny of the immediate. It planted him in the long now of divine timing. He could endure setbacks because he had glimpsed a horizon broader than next week's headline. Critics misunderstood this as fanaticism. They did not see that conviction once grounded in spiritual depth becomes the most supple of strengths, able to bend with storms without snapping, able to wait through winters for justice's spring. Finally, liberation expressed itself through language. The sacred tongue he had labored to learn reshaped his native one. Lectures once peppered with street slang grew rich with Quranic cadence. Every sentence he spoke seemed to reverberate with both indictment and invitation. Audiences felt it. The voice of a man no longer begging for acceptance but bestowing it upon himself and by extension upon them. Faith had taught him the syntax of sovereignty. Those who heard him sensed that if such certainty were possible for him, it might be possible for them as well, and that possibility was itself a jailbreak in the making, ripple effect on a nation. The power of personal reinvention, the inner conversation, a radical turning point. faith as liberation ripple effect on a nation. When one person's inner dialogue evolves from self-contempt to sacred conviction, the transformation rarely stays contained within a single life. It propagates like voltage along an uninsulated wire, shocking every structure it touches. The moment our newly liberated messenger stepped beyond prison gates, his reimagined identity began to collide with the country's oldest lies, and each collision produced sparks bright enough to guide multitudes. America in the mid-20th century was a nation rehearsing freedom while performing segregation, mouthing liberty while legislating inequality. Into that contradiction strode a man who carried himself with the calm exactness of ritual and the blazing urgency of prophecy, insisting that dignity was non-negotiable. His very posture, erect spine, measured stride, subverted caricatures that had long rendered black bodies as either docile or dangerous. He introduced a third archetype, divinely deputized. Communities that had spent decades petitioning for civil rights through patient appeals suddenly heard in his speeches a more uncompromising register. He did not beg the conscience of the oppressor, he awakened the conscience of the oppressed. Look at yourselves, he said in essence, through the lens of the Almighty rather than the keyhole of Jim Crow. In barbershops and sanctuaries, on college lawns and tenement stoops, his words detonated complacency. Young men who had been drifting toward nihilism felt a thrum of possibility and discipline. Women who had carried the double burden of racism and sexism heard confirmation that their struggles were not invisible to heaven. Even those who bristled at his militancy could not ignore the gravitational pull of his certainty. Newspapers tried to brand him incendiary, yet their headlines only amplified his reach. Curious readers sought the unfiltered recordings. Churches convened study circles to parse his claims, and the national discourse pivoted from whether change was needed to how drastic that change must be. Politically, the ripple manifested as a sharpening of agendas. Established civil rights organizations found themselves both challenged and energized. Where earlier they might have drafted cautious proposals tailored to the temperamental goodwill of lawmakers, they now drafted bolder demands lest they appear timid beside this clarion voice. His critiques of liberal paternalism forced allies to inspect their own motives, urging them to exchange charity for solidarity. Meanwhile, city officials tracking his rallies realized that fire hoses and police dogs were blunt instruments against a philosophy that wove spiritual authority with socio-economic analysis. The state could jail bodies, but it could not easily cage a narrative that claimed divine sanction for liberation. Culturally, the ripple disturbed entertainment, fashion, even diet. Movie studios, hoping to capitalize on the zeitgeist, greenlit stories with black protagonists who were thinkers rather than tokens. Tailors reported upticks in customers requesting modest yet elegant suits reminiscent of the speaker's stage attire. Head wraps and flowing garments from Africa and the Middle East began dotting Harlem's sidewalks, visual shorthand for a diaspora rediscovering pride. Restaurants in black neighborhoods introduced halal options, and corner stores stocked prayer rugs beside jazz records, proof that belief systems once embodied. Reorder marketplaces. Academia, too, felt the tremor. Sociology departments that had long pathologized black communities were forced to reckon with a man who flipped the gaze, diagnosing America's own moral sickness. Students organized teach-ins dissecting his speeches alongside Thoreau and Gandhi, tracing lineage from civil disobedience to self-defense. Professors who dismissed him as extremist confronted lecture halls, filled with undergraduates who quoted chapter and verse from his interviews, demanding curricular space for voices that rhymed with their own realities. Perhaps the most profound ripple coursed through language itself. Before his emergence, mainstream America treated terms like black power, systemic racism, and white supremacy as fringe or incendiary. After his tours, these phrases entered living room debates, television panels, and eventually congressional hearings. He had expanded the lexicon of justice, and once a society names a malady with precision, the pressure to cure it intensifies. Legislation such as the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act drew momentum not only from peaceful marches, but from the looming possibility that peace's impatient cousin might demand the podium. Lawmakers could practically feel his silhouette in the chambers, a reminder that incrementalism was running out of excuses. Internationally, the ripple crossed oceans. Newly decolonized nations in Africa and Asia saw in him an echo of their own liberation narratives, and they welcomed him as diplomat in spirit. He spoke at conferences abroad, triangulating American segregation with global imperialism, asserting that the battle for Mississippi's sharecropper was kin to the battle for Congo's miner. This global framing embarrassed U.S. diplomats who had advertised democracy while exporting inequality. It pressured Washington to consider domestic reform as foreign policy strategy. Yet for all the headlines, the most intimate ripple was psychological. Children in ghettos listened to his broadcasts and began to correct teachers who mispronounced their names, insisting on the full dignity of syllables carried from ancestral shores. Inmates recited his jailhouse study regimen, turning prison libraries into makeshift seminaries. Families once fractured by addiction found cohesion in the disciplined rhythms of prayer, fasting, and collective study circles. Hope no longer floated. It marched on time steps, clad in the armor of daily ritual and community accountability. Not all ripples were embraced as progress. Segregationists capitalized on his fiery rhetoric to stoke fear, portraying any quest for equality as a march toward insurrection. Editorials warned of urban uprisings. Legislation emerged aimed at surveilling black organizers. Yet even resistance confirmed the ripple's potency. Power never clamps down on what it does not perceive as threat. Inadvertently, the backlash validated his thesis that superficial niceties would never dismantle entrenched hierarchies, only sustained, organized pressure with the power of personal reinvention. The Inner Conversation, a radical turning point. Faith as liberation, ripple effect on a nation. The power of personal reinvention. If a caterpillar could speak, it might argue against the chrysalis. After all, every instinct it trusts tells it that crawling and devouring leaves is the total purpose of its design. Yet nature insists upon metamorphosis, wrapping the body in darkness, so it can liquefy and reassemble into something aerial. Personal reinvention works the same alchemy on a conscious human being. It demands a dissolution of the identities that once felt indispensable in order to make room for forms the imagination has not yet dared to picture. Our protagonist, once sentenced by society to an identity of menace and marginalization, chose to enter that chrysalis of faith study and disciplined self-interrogation. Inside, the street hustler melted, the public thinker crystallized, and the wings that emerged carried him across social, intellectual, and spiritual frontiers that the earlier self would have mocked as fantasy. What made his reinvention so electrifying was its refusal to conform to the incremental scripts typically accepted as growth. He did not inch toward respectability by smoothing rough edges, or adopting the posture of meek gratitude for minor gains. Instead, he performed a wholesale rewrite of his narrative, a revision so audacious it unnerved allies and adversaries alike. 1 month he was catalogued by prison authorities as inmate first and danger second. Within a handful of years he was quoted by national newspapers as a leading moral voice. Skeptics insisted the transformation must be cosmetic, publicity stunt, cult conditioning, or mere performance art. They underestimated the depth of the interior engineering underway. Daily memorization of scriptures in a language he had never heard as a child, razor-sharp dietary laws that tamed appetite, correspondence courses that required parsing history with scholarly rigor, meditative silences that replaced volatility with calibrated resolve. Reinvention, he discovered, is not a costume change. It is a cellular recalibration of values and habits until the body itself becomes a vessel capable of delivering a new message to the world. Yet the genius of his metamorphosis lay not only in its thoroughness, but in its transparency. He did not hide the journey behind mystical curtains. He narrated the process in sermons, letters, and interviews, offering listeners a blueprint for their own becoming. He described step by step how he taught himself to read beyond a 6th grade level, how he copied entire dictionaries to widen his vocabulary, how fasting unlocked a mental lucidity that addiction had long clouded. By demystifying the strenuous work of change, he shattered excuses that often paralyzed the oppressed. I'm too old, too damaged, too cornered by circumstance. His life became empirical evidence that even the most calcified narrative can be melted and recast with the fires of intention and faith. There was of course a cost. Reinvention is a rebirth, and every birth ruptures membranes, severs cords, and demands a departure from the womb of familiar approval. Old comrades viewed his spiritual attire as betrayal. Family members struggled to pronounce his newly chosen name. Journalists treated his evolving ideology like a moving target, eager to trap him in contradictions. He accepted the turbulence as the price of authenticity. When critics weaponized earlier statements against his later insights, He responded that a living mind must contradict yesterday's certainties, or confess intellectual death. In doing so, he modeled a radical permission slip for growth. You are allowed to outgrow your own quotes. His second pilgrimage, this time intellectual and transnational, pushed the reinvention even further. Surrounded by Muslims of every race inside the Grand Mosque, he experienced a brotherhood that transcended the nationalist doctrines he had previously championed. Many expected him to defend his earlier dogma out of pride. Instead, he amended it in real time, issuing communiques that stunned followers and foes alike. He confessed that his earlier lens had been too narrow, his rhetoric occasionally poisoned by the same prejudice he sought to dismantle. The courage required to audit oneself publicly, at the apex of influence, dwarfs the bravery of any street confrontation. It signaled a maturity that prized truth over brand consistency and mission over ego preservation. Personal reinvention then became iterative rather than singular, a sequence of molts rather than a one-time miracle. Each discovery triggered another cycle of self-assessment, refinement, and expansion. He approached life as a laboratory. Beliefs were hypotheses tested against scripture, reason, and lived encounter. If results evolved, the hypothesis evolved. Such dynamism inoculated him against the stagnation that calcifies many movements when charismatic founders fossilize into dogma. His followers learned to expect evolution, and more importantly to practice it themselves, thereby keeping the broader struggle supple and adaptive. From a sociological perspective, his story demonstrates that large-scale social change often hinges on the fluid identity of its key catalysts. A leader who can outgrow rigid categories invites constituencies to outgrow inherited limitations. By the same logic, oppressive systems rely on fixity. They freeze individuals in caricature so the hierarchy feels permanent. Every time he revised his own role, from hustler to minister, from nationalist firebrand to global humanist, he hacked the software of classification that sustains inequality. He proved that labels are scaffolding, not walls, and that a determined soul can climb beyond them to survey more spacious horizons. Crucially, the power of personal reinvention radiates into the mundane decisions of everyday citizens. When a single mother in Detroit quits a degrading job and enrolls in night school, she is echoing his lesson that identity is negotiable. When a teenager in Watts replaces gang insignia with a library card, he is rehearsing the chrysalis. Each small metamorphosis accumulates until society itself teeters on the edge of collective redefinition, all traced back to the precedent of one man who decided that who he was on Monday need not confine who he could be on Tuesday, and who insisted with every breath, every prayer, every fiercely revised opinion, that human beings are allowed to re-author their own narrative in partnership with the divine, rewriting not only personal destiny, but the shared story of a nation struggling toward its better self. My friends, we have walked the long arc of a single soul, heard the hush of his inner conversation, watched the midnight click of a radical turning point, felt faith unfasten his chains, traced the ripples that unsettled a nation, and witnessed the breathtaking power of personal reinvention. What began as a private whisper became a public thunderclap, reminding each of us that the story we tell inside our own heads can alter the headlines of history. When we choose words that crown rather than cage, when we surrender to a purpose larger than pain, we do more than transform ourselves. We recalibrate the moral compass of the world. So hold fast to the lesson: liberation is seeded in language, watered by faith, and harvested in action. Speak life, stand tall, and let your becoming invite all of us to become more too.